First of all, let's do some figures, shall we? Because Labour's one in, one out migrant scheme, well, 10,000 have arrived and 26 have been deported. Hardly a deterrent, is it? Looks like a catastrophic mess. In fact, there was one day in which 1,000 people arrived. 1,000, one day alone. It is an invasion, people. It is an invasion. Then we find out that the EU has rebuked France for using a plane to spy on channel crossings. It's used European Union-funded surveillance aircraft to spy on the small boats. And the European Court of Auditors, the bloc's financial watchdog, said the plane had been deployed outside the Schengen free travel zone for a third of its flight time in contravention of the rules. Well, do you know what, European Court of Auditors? Perhaps you can, for the very first time in the history of the EU, actually sign off on their own spendings, because its own Court of Auditors has never actually ticked a yes to the bookkeeping of the EU itself. Ridiculous. This, I don't know what it is with that global socialist supranational project, that they will do everything to scupper anyone closing the madly open borders. So there you go. We're going to be discussing that. A source close to the audit told The Telegraph that the aircraft in question was a Dassault Falcon 50M, flown by the French Navy on maritime surveillance missions. Paris paid for the aircraft, but it contained equipment funded by Brussels. And it was one of the examples found of cash from Brussels being misspent. What are you supposed to be using your surveillance plane for? And actually, why are they using a surveillance plane? Just to watch them go over to the channel, make sure they get here? See when is the best time with the tides to make sure even more people get on boats from Calais? Anyway, and now even worse than this. The Labour government, you may remember the Conservatives brought in legislation that said if you have broken into the country illegally, you will never be able to claim citizenship. And one of the first things the Labour Party did when it came into power was rescind all of that. And at the moment, passing through Parliament is their own version of the legislation. But it's been so watered down and diluted, it is now porous and open to legal challenge. And guess what? That legal challenge is, of course, forthcoming. After repealing the Illegal Migration Act, which says illegal immigrants should under no circumstances ever get citizenship, the Labour version is being challenged by a law firm called Wilson Solicitors, which is launching a bid to bring a judicial review of the new policy on behalf of an unnamed Syrian refugee. The firm argues it's unlawful because it fails to direct decision makers to take account of the impact of a refusal of, guess what, Article 8 of the ECHR. There is a good old ECHR, so it looks like the government could be taken to court. High Court sometime in 2026. Brilliant. You know who'll be paying that bill? Me and you, folks. Both sides of it, in fact. Let's speak now to Henry Bolton, a great friend of this programme, international border control expert. Henry, where shall we begin with all this? Let's start with the one-in, one-out policy, which was always just an absolute farce. It was never going to be a deterrent. I haven't even seen any footage of someone being, you know, seat-belted into the back of an aeroplane and sent back from whence they came, if that is, in fact, the manner in which they are returned. I mean, it's just a joke.
It's actually, I think, 360, I wrote it down here, 384.6 in and 1 out at the present rate. It's utterly ridiculous. This was never going to be a deterrent. This is quite simply, and I think everybody knows it, but the government still persists in trying to pretend otherwise. This was never going to be a deterrent. The numbers simply aren't big enough. Even if it was 1 in and 1 out, it means that the numbers don't actually change with regards to the number of people who get into the United Kingdom. So the whole thing is, I don't know how the government's managed to get away with it, because I know, you know, people like yourselves and some other outlets have addressed this, but frankly, the broadsheets and so on, this should be headlines. This is just simply misleading the British people. If they want to deal with this, the way to deal with it is quite simply to detain every single illegal immigrant securely behind wire until such time as we can return them to whence they came, or they ask to go back. Now, that does require significant legal changes, but this government doesn't seem to want to be fair, neither did the previous, want to take those legal, you know, do that legal amendment, withdraw from the ECHR and so on. They didn't want to do it. It was all too contentious for them. And that's primarily because there are too many people within those political parties who don't have the political will or determination to solve this problem.
Turns out the EU going after France for using a spy plane, a reconnaissance plane, because it's got some equipment that Brussels itself had procured, not France. The spy plane, it normally does naval reconnaissance exercises, and apparently it's been spying on channel crossings, and the EU Court of Auditors has gone, well, you know, that ain't in EU airspace, so you're actually misusing EU funding. My question is, why are they spying on the channel crossings? What, they're not doing anything about it. What are they trying to get out of this?
Well, the French, to be fair, firstly, the French are in a little bit of a difficult position. Alex, you'll remember well that one of the campaign's sort of objectives of leaving the European Union was to take control of our borders. Well, we haven't done that, but that's a matter of domestic political will, or the lack of it. But of course, the basis still exists that the European Union, the European Commission, has a significant say on how the external borders of the European Union are managed, and only by leaving could we exercise our own sovereignty over that. Well, the French are still in the European Union. The French are still sort of beholden to European Commission regulations, directives, and laws that constrain them massively. So the French, whilst trying to gain intelligence on this, have their hands somewhat tied by the European Commission in dealing with it. Now, that's something that in the UK, it's not really been addressed in the media because, of course, we've got our own domestic sort of political angle on this. But that's the reality. The French are a little bit between a rock and a hard place, and there's more to it than that. But the European Union, the Court of Auditors, frankly, is wrong. They are flat wrong on this. What they're claiming is that this equipment, and there's another aircraft as well, that was a drone that's involved in this, that they are saying was funded for use only within the Schengen area. That is fundamentally not correct. It was funded for the external borders of the European Union, and one of the external borders of the European Union is actually in the middle of the English Channel.
Well, that's what I was thinking. The Schengen area is a landmass, right? The Schengen area is a landmass. How can you have a naval maritime plane that flies over a landmass? I mean,
correct.
It doesn't make
Correct.
sense.
But also the drones are operated by the army. But the point is that the funding was never for use only within the Schengen area. In that sense, it was for use on the external borders of the European Union. And if you are providing funding to France, which has effectively no other external border apart from the English Channel, and you're providing them with funding to surveil the external borders, the only external border they're going to be surveilling is the English Channel. So, you know, but again, this you know very well. The European Union, you know, it's the same in Whitehall, but the left doesn't know what the right is doing. The Court of Auditors have looked at this. They're not borders people. They don't know the difference between the Schengen area and the external borders, technically. So this is just, it's a non-story because they've simply got it wrong. It's not the French that are out of order here. It's not the European Commission that's out of order. It's all clear, apart from the Court of Auditors don't know what they're talking about.
I sometimes wonder, though, my mind always does go to the fact that actually there are various people in Brussels who know exactly what they're doing, and various people who rapidly champion open borders, who want to see essentially the dilution and eradication of the West via means of importing a great deal of people from other cultures. And I wonder actually who tipped off the Court of Auditors in the first place. And the same is true.
True, Alex. I mean, you know, that's not. I'm not taking away from that fundamental point that I worked in Brussels for 3 years myself as Chief Planner for Common Security and Defence Policy, but I also held the portfolio for the European Commission, Common Security and Defence Policy on civilian border management. And I know that that was just before the referendum result. And I know from my interaction there that a lot of people in the European Commission and the institutions of the European Union fundamentally believe that the UK could not be allowed to be successful if we left the European Union. So, yes, you're absolutely right, but I'm talking more sort of technically. The Court of Auditors don't know what they're talking about.
I mean, that sort of reflects the next story I want to talk to you about, because it's the same thing with the Conservatives brought in legislation which would prevent anybody who arrived in the country illegally from ever claiming citizenship. Labour immediately repealed that legislation and put in place their own legislation which demonstrably seeks to do the same, but is so I mean, I'm no legal expert, but it's essentially so porous and so vulnerable that it can be legally challenged. And there you go. As night follows day, it is being legally challenged. I wonder actually if the Labour Party deliberately did that, deliberately watered down legislation, knowing that the High Courts and then potentially the Court of Appeal and then the Supreme Court will turn around and say, oh, actually, you can't do this. And then the government could say, well, we tried our best. Oh, it's not our fault. It's all these other people. Oh, well, that's international law, beloved international law. I think actually when it comes to Hermit and Starmer, they're brilliant schemers. I think they know exactly what they're doing in the same way as they're playing silly buggers around China at the moment. Oh, no, we can't give that evidence. That's not us. It's not our responsibility. It's the previous government, which actually stinks when it comes to the Chinese spy case. I think when it comes to changing the Conservative Party legislation, reframing it and reworking it, and then finding, oh, look, it's now being challenged under the ECHR, could well have been the plan all along. What do you make of it?
You're absolutely right again, Alex. You know, the Conservative government, the Rwanda scheme, you know, the legislation for that had one significant gap in it, a significant loophole in it, which I and others talked about. Rishi Sunak decided not to close that. So had it all gone through, then we'd have still had these legal appeals against Rwanda. That's why Rwanda could never have worked operationally, because that loophole was there. We've still got the same thing going on. Now, with countries that I've helped, you know, I learned the first time that, you know, you had to do something fundamental in every country that I helped, and there were 57 I provided advice to, 14 who I helped them to design or to write their national border strategy. And in 13 of those 14 cases, we had to do a massive review of all existing, extant legislation and consolidate it into one act of parliament, repealing everything else. But in this country, you know, whether it's the NHS or whatever it is, we have, and taxation and planning regulations and all sorts of legislation, whether it's criminal or otherwise, we end up piling one piece of legislation on another and another, and we apply a legal patch to this or a legal patch to that, or a government decides that it's got to do a little bit of legislation to as a sop to public opinion. And so we end up with this totally chaotic mess that is British legislation. What we need to do with the borders is we need to consolidate all of the applicable legislation on our borders into one act of parliament and repeal everything else, because otherwise it's just an absolute nightmare to navigate through and identify all the loops, because it's not just loopholes, Alex, it's contradictions. And when you have two pieces of legislation that slightly contradict each other in their wording, maybe one was written in 1965 and one was written in 2025, and they slightly contradict each other, even if because the legal terminology or language has changed subtly, then you end up with an opportunity for a defence lawyer or an appeals lawyer to exploit that. And that's precisely what they do. So the government, again, is at fault here, successive governments.
I always wonder whether it's done willfully or not. That is always the big question mark that hangs in my head. Henry Bolton, international border control expert, thank you ever so much.